So let's talk about the difference in the research you've done, the folks you've talked to, and your own experiences with the people in your community. Um, I have to imagine the distinction between being a young man and being a young woman going through this process must be vastly different,
Right.
both from a maturity standpoint on both sides, and also just all the challenges that a young man or young woman face in the world if they didn't have this hanging over their heads. So, can you walk
Mhm.
us through a little bit of? Let's start with the young men. Unfortunately, because there's such a stigma about this idea that if you're a young teenage boy, you must be up to no good. And that's unfortunately something in the United States for our listeners abroad. And this is not the only country where that is sometimes said about young migrant men, but it's an extra stigma on top of all of the other things. How much does that
Mhm.
play into the psyche of these individuals, and how much does that create additional barriers for them as they're trying to, as you said, orient themselves in a new culture?
Yeah, all of these stigmas, it's so interesting because at the time that I was doing this research, in 2012, folks will remember that was the time where DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, was being introduced. So there was this image of what a productive or good immigrant teenager was at the time that I was entering the field. Come 2014, unaccompanied minors, unaccompanied children, as vulnerable or as a threat to the border and to the U.S. nation state, was a new sort of discourse that the people that I was researching had to grapple with. And then come 2016 and the introduction of a new election cycle, the framing of Central American youth, Central American men in particular, as deviant, as criminal, as a threat to um, communities and the American, in quotes, body, like the physical body of Americans, right? So I was able to see through the course of my research how young people made sense of what exactly what you're saying, the stigmatizing discourse of the U.S. political nation state and also the sort of social worlds that young people were occupying. Men are positioned in that discourse as the threat, right? And in a sort of cultural context, from a Latin American cultural context to the US, and we see it in the US cultural context as well, men are framed as independent, emotionally void, as maybe financially capable of sustaining themselves and their families. There's the expectation that the young men that would migrate to the US would be providing remittances to support left behind families. So the young men in this research really, we're dealing with a lot of pressures, right? A lot of external pressures and expectations. And of course, they're also just teenagers that want partners and are attracted to people and feel like they have to physically look a certain way. So there's all kinds of external pressures on their shoulders. The men really talked about the struggle of taking care of themselves as independent teenagers transitioning into adulthood and their needs and the overwhelming emotions they were dealing with, that disorientation. But also, I remember young people saying things like, my hormones were changing. Things were just out of control. And there wasn't a parent or a sibling or someone to really tell them, well, this is why you feel anxiety, or this is why you feel sudden bouts of sadness, right? Or just overwhelming emotions. I remember I kept analyzing for this code, right? Like overwhelming emotions. Everyone was talking about emotions being haywire, men and women. But because men are expected to be independent and tough and not feel all of the things, there was no place for men to really put that. Um, Especially outside of protective households. The women, on the other hand, dealing with some of those same larger frames of like the immigrant threat, but because women are seen as docile, sensitive, maybe more dependent, and then more emotionally vulnerable, the women were sort of protected in a lot of ways from the expectation that they would just toughen up and just go through it, right? And even in our conversations, there were a lot more tears in the interviews. There was a lot more expression of how difficult it was to be away from mom, dad, or siblings in the US context. Um, I have a lot more to say about gender dynamics, but I'll let you ask the question.
No, let's keep going. I think this is a very important topic because we lump unaccompanied minors together as if they are one monolith that are all
Yes.
experiencing the same thing. They're not, and there's a lot of different things happening. But I do think that gender dynamics are an important one because it feels like the conversation is always tinged with assumptions about what
Mhm.
either side of that is feeling. And you're talking about an age group where I don't care where you're from or where you grew up, like your teenage years are tough years for
They're
anybody.
tough. In the best this is what I say, like in the best circumstances, I was, am US born, English speaking. Both of my parents were around. They had citizenship status. My mom bought me my first car. All and like still it was hard, Like I was in school, I went to UCLA, and still it was hard. So I always think like when you layer all of the disadvantages and all of the forms of marginalization and the fact that young people are doing it alone, right? And oftentimes that their networks are other unaccompanied teenagers. Um, it is both the challenge in the longer term and the strength of the community in that these young people grow up very innovative and very strategic in the things that they do and where they spend their time and resources. But gender, yeah, I think is one of the gender and also ethno-racial identity is one of two of the things that I bring up over and over in the book because men, as much as they are emotionally or interpersonally disadvantaged, they are better positioned in at work in that men are paid more than women are paid. Men are sort of at liberty to participate in public community life in ways that women are expected to be home and in private. So, in terms of getting information about new jobs or cheaper rent or where to go for whatever resource they might need, women are disadvantaged a lot of the time, right? They don't have those networks. They can't be out past, after dark. They can't just make friends with just about anyone because of the physical insecurity that they or lack of safety, I should say, that women um, feel. And then also they have less options to cope. Women have less options to cope with the sadness and the disorientation because they are really confined to households a lot of, or that the work that they do is as domestic workers or as nannies. So they're constantly just in private spaces in ways that men are not. So there are advantages and disadvantages in being on both sides. And yeah, then you get into the in between of youth sexuality and sexual orientation, and it gets a lot more complicated.